Who is this man?
Tom Brady.
Tom Brady. And this is how I opened the book with a discussion of the Super Bowl, no, the NFC Championship in 2015. The Patriots beat the Colts. The allegation was that during halftime, somehow Tom Brady, with the assistance of others, deflated the footballs, right? Because he prefers a slightly deflated football. So to make a long story short, the NFL though, and the commissioner really want to go after Tom Brady, and but you have to have scientific proof, right? You can't just say, well, he deflated football. So what did they do? They hired a law firm, but then the law firm hired the sort of analysis, a company called Exponent, which had worked for the tobacco industry, saying that indoor tobacco smoke, environmental tobacco smoke, really doesn't cause lung cancer. Worked for the asbestos industry, saying, you know, asbestos doesn't cause all the diseases we know. In fact, is one of the product defense companies that's most commonly used. And of course, they did produce a report that then was put up by the attorneys, saying all evidence is, based on our studies, that Brady deflated football. If you go online, and I didn't pull this down, but there are dozens of physicists around the country who have totally disputed this and said that's nonsense. In fact, there's a wonderful YouTube from a professor of mechanical engineering and physics at MIT who goes through all the reasons it's wrong. But he describes at the beginning, he says, I'm at MIT, but I'm really an Eagles fan, so you know. But the main point is that the instinct of many corporations and many leaders, when you have an allegation that you have to prove or disprove, you hire someone who will give you the result you want, not necessarily the truth. That's the premise of the book. Of course, the most famous example of this is tobacco. Right? And you know, we all, and people in this room, are familiar with the history of the tobacco industry's prevarications, lies. But you know, I'm told that actually a lot of people who are don't remember, who weren't there for the big fights in the 1990s, don't know the history of what tobacco did, which essentially, you know, tobacco spent a lot of time in the 1930s and 40s, in this case, saying that, you know, tobacco is safe. You know, it doesn't cause throat irritation, doesn't cause lung disease. More doctors use whatever, you know, smoke whatever type of cigarettes and others. And that was all fine until really about 1950, when the first studies came out showing linking tobacco, cigarette smoking, and lung cancer. And they really only occurred, the first studies were done in the late 40s and 50s, because the lung cancer epidemic from tobacco didn't start until the 1940s, because the first significant exposures occurred during World War I, when many soldiers were given tobacco as free ration, and they came back from Europe addicted. And if you started smoking in 1918, you know, 20 years later is 1938, sort of the first time you start seeing it. In the 40s was when lung cancer started rising. Lung cancer was a rare disease at the beginning of the 20th century. And so all of a sudden you had all these studies, 3 studies in the early 1950s showing lung cancer was associated with cigarette smoking. And the tobacco industry said, okay, we have a problem. Actually, James Hill from the Hill and Knowlton Company went to them and said, you really need to approach this very differently. You've got to say you're very interested in this, in research, you're going to fund this, but as long as you can essentially show that the science isn't proven, you can continue to sell your product. And that's what they did. And they, this isn't really working. If I close this. So the memos are really fascinating. They all came out in litigation around tobacco. This is a famous memo that I used to name my first book, where Brown and Williamson, which is a tobacco company's, cigarette company's executive, said, this is what we do. Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It's the means of establishing controversy. And they spent decades essentially establishing controversy. They, one of my favorites, they actually have a regular newsletter that went out to scientists and physicians, reports on tobacco and health. Anything that suggested something other than tobacco caused lung cancer was what they focused on. So of course, this one here, lung cancer rare in bald men. Exactly. It's not true, it turns out. So Hill and Knowlton, though, became sort of this expert in how do you help companies address allegations that their product is dangerous. This is a press, this is not press back, but a packet that Hill and Knowlton used to promote their work. This was actually sent to a Beryllium company, and Beryllium is using nuclear weapons. When I was at the Energy Department, I was like the chief safety officer for the nuclear weapons complex, which is how I eventually saw this document. And they say, this is what we can do. We can give you examples of what we've done around vinyl chloride, cancer, asbestos, dioxin, etc. Saying we can essentially help you sell your dangerous product without fear of government regulation. So it's a great document. It goes from pages and pages. But to give you one example, fluorocarbons and ozone depletion, the ozone hole, you probably recall this. This is their description, and they use the word allegations, and that's important because it's all framed as sort of legal concept. This is not, in science we only talk about allegations, but scientific allegations that fluorocarbons released from aerosol spray cans are a threat to the ozone layer, that have become a cause célèbre in the media and government, despite the fact there was no real scientific proof of the charges. It will be years before facts could be assembled. The media fastened on the threat to increase skin cancer and the doomsday aspect of the story. Public concern and fear of the future caused fluorocarbon users to look to alternatives. Hill and Knowlton was asked by DuPont to help calm fears, get better reporting of the issues, and gaining up to 2 or 3 years before the government took action to ban fluorocarbons. So they were successful in essentially delaying government action, which eventually came. And so the ozone hole got that much bigger. DuPont was able to maintain market share as they moved to a new product. So it was a success for everybody involved, except for the people of the earth. But this is this is a typical example. Now, the fluorocarbon issue was an interesting one. The 3 scientists who sort of presented this, there wasn't really a debate. When they put this out, they said, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. In fact, they shortly won the Nobel Prize for actually that work, essentially figuring out that these fluorocarbons, how they would react with the atmosphere and cause the ozone hole. But that didn't stop DuPont and Hill and Knowlton from questioning the science for a couple of years, and that's really all they needed. A famous document in this world is this written by Frank Luntz, who you might see on TV once in a while. He's a sort of spin master guy. He talks about the words you use are really important. He's on Fox News all the time. He has since recanted all of this, but he did this as a memo to the Republican Party saying this was around climate change. The scientific debate remains open. Lawyers believe there's no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their view about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make lack of scientific certainty. I mean, it's tragic, obviously. This went on for years. He sort of said, I was wrong now. This is years and years later. And of course, the petroleum industry and the Koch brothers funded institutes to pursue this line. And this is now, unfortunately, dogma of the Republican Party. It's slowly being changed now, but obviously it's very late. So this has become an industry, though. And people market it, and there's big money to be made. This was a PowerPoint I found on the web from a group called the Weinberg Group, saying this is, you need to hire us. Look, it happened to asbestos, it happened to tobacco, pharmaceuticals. You're next. You really need help. There's all this scare science, and this is an important concept, the loss of presumptive innocence. So the frame that they put on their chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. And that's what we have to fight for. Until you can show it's guilty, until you can show it's dangerous, we have to assume it's safe. And that's the sort of frame that they put on this. I call this the Enronization of science. Now, anyone here, who remembers the company Enron? Well, most of you do. So Enron, of course, was a company that was built, it was a house of cards, essentially, right? It didn't, they bought and sold energy futures. They made up what their profit figures were, but some people made a huge amount of money when it collapsed. Turned out there was nothing there. Many people lost their pensions. A lot of stockholders lost a lot of value. A very well-known accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, really went bankrupt because they were convicted of liability. They couldn't continue and they had to go out of business because they certified all this stuff as being real, even though it was totally fake. And sort of like this around, this is what they do for science. Essentially, these businesses, product defense businesses, hire scientists. Maybe I should move over here. Anyway, they hire scientists to defend products, not in, really in the scientific world, but in the regulatory and legal arenas. And their value is to influence regulation. That's why you hire one of them, not because you want to really get valid science. In fact, the science they produce, I think, is of questionable value. It doesn't really contribute to what we think of as the scientific apparatus. And what's interesting, recently I've gone on to Glassdoor, which is, for those of you who look for jobs, it's check out what people are saying about companies who they work for, and ask, okay, well, what do people who work for these companies say? And so, Cameras, which is one of the big ones, I found this quote: "This is a law consulting company, not a science consulting company. Don't expect to be a scientist." They advertise themselves as scientists. Some of the principal scientists have questionable ethics and they're called out for it. Sometimes you will be working for evildoers and trying to make it seem like they do nothing wrong. Those are the people who work for them. And we see it all the time. And the press is finally getting hip to this. This was an article of the Center for Public Integrity looking at all the studies that Ford paid for to try to make it look like asbestos in brake shoes doesn't cause cancer. And they got all the studies, but they got the memos that went up to it. They have the receipts, how much it cost to do these studies, and essentially to seed the scientific literature with studies saying, we looked at this and we don't think that there's a risk. It costs a lot of money, but if you're being sued by, in this case, workers with mesothelioma who believe they got that from the exposure in your workplaces or from your products, it's well worth it. So this is then sort of what I'm trying to write about in this book, which that's the very dramatic cover. And so I thought I'd tell sort of one story from that, because there are many stories in there. But I thought I'd talk about diesel exhaust, because that's an issue of great interest to our department. We have a bunch of people who work on these issues. Diesel comes from, and it's a big problem all over the world. A lot of it comes from trucks and buses, cars as well, but trucks and buses are much worse cause of them. A couple more pictures, but diesel engine exhaust. Essentially, it's hard to read this, but there are a lot of components. It's a total mishmash, and different diesel engines put out different ratios of these materials, but obviously you worry about, well, the large amounts of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, large amounts of that. Nitrogen oxides, or NOx, gas related to heart disease and lung disease, asthma, and a bunch of other things, and particulate matter. And the particulate matter itself is a mix of a lot of things. It's mostly carbon, and that's that black stuff you see, but other things attached to that, and can be carrying metals and a number of other things as well. So that's what comes out of a diesel engine. We know that the NOx are very well studied. In fact, Susan Annenberg, who's one of our faculty here, out on parental leave right now, has done a lot of very important work, and this was a study that she did and published in Nature a few months ago. This is from annual premature deaths attributable on-road diesel vehicle NOx emissions. This is not particulates, this is just the NOx across the globe, and this is 100,000 people a year. We don't need to go into detail, you can see how bad that is. But so we've known about the NOx exposures and effects for a long time. There's a big question though about the particulates. And do the particulates themselves have a health impact? It's been suggested for a long time that these particulates are lung carcinogens. But it's difficult to study. I mean, if you're talking about free living people in cities where there's a lot of pollution, you can't really separate out diesel particulates from other exposure. But there are a few places where you can look purely at the diesel exposure and attempt to determine whether or not it's causing lung cancer. And that's actually in certain types of underground mines where diesel equipment is used. Puts out, and you get a lot of particulate exposure, you get NOx as well, though we know NOx is not a carcinogen. And these mines don't have asbestos or radon. So the National Cancer Institute and the National Institute for Occupational Safety Health mounted a study, actually a series of studies, starting in the early 1990s, where they chose, I think, eight of these mines, and they followed the workers for a long time. They got cigarette smoking histories. And it's a longer story I tell in the book, which I'm not going to go into today. The industry used congressional intervention to slow down the study and slow it down for at least 5 years. But finally, 2 studies were published simultaneously in 2011. Actually, they published a whole bunch of studies at the same time, the methods, measurement, which both found the various things they looked at. This is the NIOSH one, this is the NCI one, but they're linked, obviously. In fact, underground miners who are exposed to diesel particulates have higher risk of lung cancer, and the only thing it could be attributed to is the diesel exhaust particulate. So we're not going to get better studies of this. That was sort of all we could do. There's actually a study simultaneously done of truck drivers, but those exposures are confounded in various ways, but they find the same result. So when these came out, 2011, it was a very big deal. The International Agency for Research on Cancer then convened a panel, and they said, well, you know, diesel engine exhaust is a carcinogen, which has very important implications for policy around the world. That was, of course, a problem for the diesel industry. So they hired the same product consultants, product defense consultants, that we've seen in other industries, and they started doing reviews. And of course, their reviews, you won't be surprised to say they looked at the studies very carefully, and they just don't show that they cause lung cancer. And they do one review after another, and then eventually they get the raw data from the NIOSH and NCI studies, and they reanalyze them over and over again, and they always say there's no effect or it's confounding, and they just do it over and over again. They're not really believable, frankly, and they have almost no impact on policy, but they're pushed by the industry.
I'm just curious, and maybe you're going to talk about this, but what types of journals are they published in?
Well, a lot of them are in critical reviews in toxicology and regulatory toxicology and pharmacology and toxicology, which are the 2 journals that they always publish in. They're their own peer reviewers, and you know, they get very little feedback. They can publish. They will publish letters in, like JNCI, the Journal of National Cancer Institute, which published the studies we saw earlier. They will publish a letter saying, you know, we don't agree. But these studies tend to be published in these journals, which I think of sort of vanity journals. You know, their industry publishes in them, and they always find no results. But these aren't that effective. If IARC has said it's a carcinogen, it gets a lot of press, and it was particularly a problem for who? For Volkswagen. Because Volkswagen had made a commitment to really become the #1 car company in the world on the basis of their new diesel engine. They have a new diesel engine technology. This is in, you know, sort of the 2010 range, where they were saying this is clean diesel, and the great commercials, Mr. Clean, maybe remember him, and these are great. You know, you can pull out any of these. It just shows these incredibly clean machines that are diesel. Of course, diesel gives you a very snappy drive. It's in Europe, diesel is actually discounted as well, so it's a very popular fuel. But here, diesel is not less expensive than regular, so they have to be marketed. You get a great drive, you get a lot of pickup, and it's clean. That was how they marketed it. So all of a sudden, when IARC says, okay, diesel engine exhaust is a carcinogen, that was a problem for them. They said, how are we going to respond? And there's some wonderful emails that came out. This is from the corporate communications manager of Audi, which is a Volkswagen subsidiary. You know, any guidance you might be able to give regarding this World Health Organization, that's IARC, assertion that diesel is carcinogen would help us with counter messaging. This would include studies that might contradict the report below. We have also requested with similar. So we need to count. You know, there's some studies. There's a a panel at IARC that says, like, so we have to counter message. And this is coming from the PR office, not that scientists saying we disagree, but the instinct is to say, you know, it's got to be wrong, but we got to make sure people think it's wrong, right? That's the model. So the communications people at Volkswagen got together and they said, well, you know, you can't do a study involving people and particulates to cancer because it would take 30 years, and you really can't do that study, and there's no way to do it. You could do an animal study, but that, you know, we've done animal studies before, but you really need to study with people. And so they said, well, let's do a study on NOx, on nitrogen oxides, rather than particulates. So they're already sort of going off track here. But you know, there are a lot of studies done where you have volunteers who breathe limited amounts of NOx, and then you test their lungs for various things. That could be done with people, and it's quite ethical to do under the right circumstances. So the model that Volkswagen came up with was they were going to put people in a chamber, put them on a bicycle, and they were going to, while they were exercising, they were going to pump in this gas. And the optics of a German company pumping gas into these chambers, someone sort of realized that wasn't going to work. Fortunately for them, I guess. So they decided instead, we'll do it with monkeys. So they went to Lovelace Respiratory Research Institute in New Mexico, which does studies with non-human primates. They also do rat studies. They've done a lot of studies on diesel, some which are better than others. Get into that separately. But they said, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do that same study where we put non-human primates in chambers. We're going to pump in nitrogen oxides, and we're actually going to do it from a car. We'll hook up essentially the exhaust from a car. We'll filter it so it gets the particulates out. We'll measure what goes in, and then we're going to test the essentially the effect on the lung and inflammation on the lung. It's a short-term test. And the way they have to do that is they have to do a baseline lavage on the lungs of the animals, and it's going to be, they're essentially going to be their own control. So each animal would get tested 3 times. Would get first get a lavage before as a baseline, get exposed to a lot of nitrogen oxides from a new diesel technology vehicle, or perhaps a much higher level from an old diesel, or just air as the, filtered air as the control. That was the model. So the German Auto Industry Trade Association signs an agreement with Lovelace in 2013. Officially, it's with this trade association, the EUGT, which is Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, and Bosch, which is a engine company. But the guy who runs it is a Volkswagen person and still has his Volkswagen email address. And it's $700,000, 50% signed with 50% with the agreement, 40% on completion of the in-life portion of the research, and 10% once the final report is available. And it has to be kept confidential. The study will be kept confidential until everybody agrees it will be released. Now, this alone is problematic. There was an agreement by the editors of most of the major medical journals saying they would no longer, this is 15 years ago, would no longer publish articles if the primary author didn't have absolute right to publish and had to sign something like this. But that didn't stop them from essentially saying, okay, you're not going to be able to publish this until we all agree. When in fact, you can't even talk about it for up to 5 years after its conclusion until we all agree. So that was the premise of doing it. And so the idea is they're going to compare what happens to monkeys' lungs after they breathe in air from a new VW Beetle with this new technology, this great new engine that VW has come up with, against a 16-year-old Ford F-250. Now, I chose a really dirty slide example, but maybe this is more fair because it's a well-tuned one. But that's the basic idea. Now, the Germans actually insisted that the comparison not be an old BMW or Mercedes, or it had to be an American car. And VW kindly offered to provide that Volkswagen. And James Lang, the leader of Diesel Competence from VW America, who works in Los Angeles, drove the VW himself to New Mexico and set it up on the machine, which stays in one place so they could get the exhaust to pump into where the monkeys were. And of course, you probably know what the next slide is. What he didn't tell them was it had a defeat device, which is what Volkswagen put in, that when you bring a Volkswagen with this new technology, engine and defeat device, into an auto emissions testing station, it knows based on your steering wheel and where the wheels are if it's being tested, and puts out essentially no NOx. If you drive it on the road, it puts out 40 times the NOx. And VW has actually had to pay tens of billions of dollars when they were finally caught. It's an amazing story about how they got caught, but they did finally get caught. This is before they were caught. And so he brings this Volkswagen. So he eventually pleads guilty, by the way, because he was one of the people who arranged for in the United States to happen and lied about it when it happened. But it all came out of Germany, and the CEO knew about it. It's not like he's just the fall guy. But so essentially you had a study that they want to do, but it's a rigged study, right? I mean, what's going to happen?
Sorry, can you speak actually a little bit more about the relationship between the discovery and the lies that they told about the
what happened was,
studies?
there's an organization that actually Susan worked closely with, whose name I'm just blanking on.
We've had him present and
Yes.
told the story.
Yes.
It was very serendipitous
Yes.
how they discovered it.
Yes, the guy's name is Kojak or something. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. But essentially, the Europeans do not have such strong diesel emission regulations as we do. And so some folks here in America said, well, let's show them that their cars can be successful in a tighter regulatory environment. We'll tell the Europeans. So they went and got a couple of European cars, and instead of just testing them in an auto emission station, they actually put a non-stationary testing thing on the back of the car and drove it around. And they actually went to California because they couldn't even find one of these. It was University of West Virginia got the contract. They didn't even have any of these BMWs or Volkswagens in West Virginia. And so they went to California. They happened to find two VW diesels, a Passat and a Rabbit, I think. Anyway, they hooked this on, and they drove it all around California. And the levels they were finding were astronomically high. And they said, something's wrong with our machine, because every test says the levels are low. And they did it again and again. And the California Air Resource Board, the CARB, which has very strong emissions control rules, Trump is now trying to override all that right now. But they said, they met with Lang and others and said, what's going on? And at some point they said, well, it's the software. They did a software fix which actually made the problem worse and harder to find. They totally lied about everything, VW. So finally the EPA said, we don't understand this. We are not going to certify the 2016 model to be sold in the United States unless you come clean. And they finally said, okay, I'll tell you what really is going on here, which is the software in the engine essentially said, if you're on a dynamometer it's called, then you're just not going to put out any NOx. There's a little device in there which uses urea to capture any of the emissions, and it never gets turned on except when it's in the dynamometer. Because normally you'd have to replace that every, I don't know how many thousand miles, but with VW you would never have to replace it because it really was never used. Anyway, when Volkswagen came clean, they're now, the photos are amazing. The thousands of VWs they have to recall, and they're sitting in the desert somewhere so they're not destroyed by the rain. And VW has to pay large fines in the United States, and Canada, and Korea, and Europe. And every few months you read about a higher level person who's been indicted, including now the CEO, because they all knew about this. And but they were able to sell a lot. They became the #1 car seller in the world briefly because they convinced people that the car was safe, and they're paying for that now, obviously. By the way, and VW has announced they're going all electric. They're not. They're just. Anyway, so this guy brought so they do the study. They set the monkeys up in chambers. They actually have to bring TVs in because the monkeys don't really want to sit still for all the period that Yeah. So in the image, couldn't find a picture. Monkeys in a chamber watching TV while they're pumping oil themselves. The problem is, they did the study so badly. They did the lavage, the broncho lavage first, because you have the background, and then the same day that they exposed them to the VW emissions, which really, there was nothing in there. And then shortly after that, the next day or something like that, then they tested them, they looked at how much inflammation. Then they did the same thing a couple of days later with the stuff from the Ford. They actually found that the monkeys had more inflammation following the VW exposure, really because they'd done the broncho lavage that morning, and that's what they were measuring. So they totally got the results wrong, and then they realized that the study was rigged. They didn't know this at first. This is a memo from this study director saying less than 1% is old technology diesel engine. I believe in our car that system was on default. In other words, so comparison of this is the air, new technology, old technology, and there's almost no difference between the air and the new technology, and the old technology is 300 times higher, not NOx. So the study would have been used, if they'd done the study right, they would have found overwhelmingly that the Ford was much worse for the monkeys than the Volkswagen, but they didn't do the study right. But the study was rigged anyway. But of course, the funny thing then, what happens is that Volkswagen won't pay for the last 10% because they don't like the results they're seeing. Lovelace, here's they're saying, here are the results of the draft report. The lavage data are garbage. It's too late. The guys did the baselines the day before the actual exposure lavage. There was information from the baselines. I need to publish a paper, and basically I'll have to throw out the lavage data. So Volkswagen and the Germans are saying you have to publish a paper. They didn't realize the study is rigged, and they have the wrong result. But Volkswagen is saying we won't give you $70,000 until you publish a paper. And they're willing to go along with it, and that's what's so amazing about this. Both the scientists and the corporate people are totally corrupt in this case. So they eventually published something which isn't as bad as there are 3 or 4 different drafts of the abstract. The last one, they just pretend they never tested the Volkswagen emissions. They're just comparing the Ford to nothing. And no surprising, you're exposed them to a lot of monkeys to a lot of NOx. They have inflammation in their lung. There's some ethical questions. If anyone read this, says, why would you do this study? We've known this for thousands of years. But this is essentially one example of, you can't believe this is going on, but this is what corporate science is getting you. So we're seeing this now, though. It's not just in this is one example, but there are tons of examples in the world of clean air, in clean water, and certainly this issue around some of the very big issues you're going to see right now around sort of PFAS, the polyfluorinated materials that are in water supplies all over the country, and you've got the same debate and the very same people who are working for companies who work on asbestos, who worked on lead, worked on others, are now working for DuPont and 3M, essentially saying that these PFAS chemicals are safe. Lead exposure in children, I think this is an area that has been litigated in the scientific world, so we no longer have to debate the subject. But in fact, there's a big lawsuit in Newark, everybody on TV quite a bit, where the same consulting firm, Gradient, that was doing this work 20 years ago for the battery industry, is there saying, lead exposure just isn't so bad. The evidence, low-level lead exposure in kids is not something you have to worry about so much. The sugar industry did this for years. In fact, there's some really amazing memos from a guy who retired as head of the Sugar Research Foundation, who wrote a letter to the tobacco industry in 1954 saying, I did this for sugar, you really need my help now for dealing with tobacco. Sugar-sweetened beverages, there's a major campaign paid for by the American Beverage Association and Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Essentially, they're trying to make the case that if you exercise enough, then you can drink as much sugar-sweetened beverages as you want. It's gotten a lot of press. The New York Times did series of articles on it, but certainly well-known epidemiologists have been dragged into this, and really sort of unfortunately. The alcohol beverage industry, which does not want to admit that alcohol beverages cause cancer, that relatively low amounts of concentration, drinking of alcohol will increase risk of breast cancer. They will tell you that drinking a lot of booze is bad for you, but moderate consumption, let's say, is good for you. Anyway, each of these is a chapter of the book. We don't have time to go into today. But I think it has a big impact, not just on public health, but also on science. And if everybody thinks that just, every issue is there are sort of debating scientists, equal and opposite scientists on both sides, that's not what science is. And I think it makes us all look bad. And people don't take the findings of science as seriously. I think we need to think about how we want our government, our regulatory agencies, and the science community to think about the results of science. So, came up recently this question of vaping. Everyone's seen this. We have 12 deaths now, 1,000 cases. The majority of cases are people who were vaping THC, but probably about 15–20% are saying no. In the initial articles about this, they quote someone from the Juul company saying, we looked at some of these studies and found toxic chemicals in the e-cigarette liquid, and we don't think those are applicable. These are Juul's liquid. We don't think those are applicable to real-life situations. Now, when I read that, I said, well, that may be true, but why would we believe anything a tobacco company said about the science of the hazards of their product? And Juul is 35% owned by Altria, Philip Morris. The history is too fraught with these problems. And, we have to insist that research be done by unconflicted scientists. Which isn't to say that Juul and companies like that shouldn't pay for the research, but we need to think about how do we set up a research system that companies that make a product pay for the research, but at the same time don't control the results. And that's the challenge, but that's what we need to be doing. There's a lot of talk about how to do that through NIH. NIH has been burned twice doing this. Once they agreed to take money from the National Football League to do a big study of chronic traumatic encephalopathy following football. The NFL pledged like $30 million. They made a down payment. But then when the NIH study section awarded the grant to do the study to Boston University, rather than someone connected to the NFL said, wait, we don't like this way to pull the study. Even though they'd unrestricted funding. Then a couple years later, NIH, different branch of NIH, decided to set up a big study with the alcohol industry, looking at the effects of moderate drinking, but did it in a way essentially that guaranteed a certain result and really in very close collaboration with the industry. And when it came out, Francis Collins just said, we can't do this. So it's complicated, but we have to think about how we're going to do this. But the other thing is I think we have to think of toxic chemicals differently. The models we have, the agencies we have, all regulate on an individual basis, each chemical by chemical. There are 4,500 PFAS substances. And we have good human evidence on sort of maybe 2. And we have animal evidence on maybe a few dozen more, maybe. So what are we going to do with all of them? We have to start treating them as a class of chemicals rather than this idea we're going to look at one chemical, then the next, and the next. And as part of that, we have to essentially say they're not innocent until proven guilty. If we have enough indication that there's some hazard there, we should control exposure until we think they're safe. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence of harm, and that's a really important lesson. And so what we have to do is end the presumption of innocence. So we left a couple minutes for questions. Sorry we started a little bit late, but